Guys, how are you doing today? I had a rather rough day at work, and this rough day at work reminded me of how important it is to have hobbies and to invest in something else than going every day to a corporation and feeling empty inside. Me, I still have my books to keep me company, and I wanted to take advantage that I have just finished Follett's Fall of Giants to actually talk about it and not write about it. This past week I spent over 4 hours or something like that writing a post, and I got so angry with WordPress, like angry on so many levels you have no idea. They have changed that platform over 3 times already in the past 2 years or so, not that I was counting. I was just discovering changes as I went in, and now it looks like shit. I mean, you cannot format anything. There's no justified on anything. The code is awful to edit and work around. And I decided to not spend any more time on it. So I'm gonna talk about the book via this thing. Feeling lately that the dawn of blogging has come and that it's becoming increasingly difficult to make people migrate from a platform to another. Plus, with all the minimal design thingies, I think they just complicated their existence even more. Because if it's not gonna be quick and easy to edit a post, then no one is gonna spend much time there. And no one is gonna spend hours putting their post there just like that. The dawn of blogging has come the same way the dawn of me washing my clothes has come. Please apologize the stains. This is my cooking outfit, so yeah. The Fall of Giants. As I was saying, I love the book. It's absolutely stunning, but it's stunning only if you look at it as a story. You should not expect a lot of literary artifice. You should not expect some fancy vocabulary. It's not groundbreaking literature. It's just feel-good literature. The sort we all need from time to time to just chill and relax and detach and everything. I am living proof that that works, as I have read on the bus coming to work and from work. I read at home. I spent over 2.5 weeks reading it, and it actually entertained me because it has all the ahs and ahs and everything, and it also has memorable characters, although they are not so deep. They're just characters. They are just, I wouldn't say types. They're just normal people put in extraordinary circumstances. I have mentioned here and there bits and pieces about the plot, especially in the first post. If you haven't read it already, do please go and read it. The link is in my bio. There I presented already a bit the 6 characters and their stories and how they mingle and how they go into each other. The main focus of the story is obviously the Great War, and the Fall of Giants is both the fall of great nations and is also the fall of old society models that have become antiquated and that needed to change after a conflict of such magnitude. So I'm not gonna stress too much on the plot. I'm just gonna mention the 3 big themes of the book, or the 3 big themes that I identified as being relevant to the whole story. One of the biggest ones that comes here and there throughout the book is the theme of love. Obviously, you must have history, and with history some story or conflict of love. It's present in every historic novel. It's impossible to have a historic novel, I think, without this love conflict. what's interesting about this book is the fact that it shows different sorts of love, and it shows them as a gradient. You have the first type of love, which is the clandestine love. It appears between Fitz and Ethel, but there's also another sort of clandestine love, which is the love between Walter and Maud. These loves are different, but are different in very subtle ways. The love relationship between Fitz and Ethel is in fact a sort of love triangle, because Fitz is married to Princess Bea, which makes the whole relationship between Ethel and Fitz an illicit one. It's also a relationship that comes from a place of manipulation and subjugation, because in the story, Fitz uses Ethel to fulfill his own desires, and then treats her badly after all. This is a pattern that will come throughout the story. He usually just uses women to satisfy his own desires along the way, and then dumps them to go and find the next big thing. Which is one of the reasons why I truly despise him as a character, and I hope that he would get shot in the big war. But more on the war part. On the contrary, there's the relationship between Walter and Maud, which comes in the purest form. They are secretly married, and they sincerely love each other and care for each other, although they are separated by war, basically. And although they are married, they just spend 2 or 3 nights together over a period of 5 years, I think. It's also a love that is pure and it's honest, as Walter already illustrates his desire to be with Maud from the very first time. And they're lovely and they're cute, and I really enjoyed their story because it was one of the most constant relationships, and it was one of the most flamboyant and fiery throughout. This bit of love is also shown as a gradient. Because while the first affair starts out of subjugation and manipulation, we see that love evolves towards being a relationship that binds two people that have a lot in common together, which is something unheard of before the Great War, as I'll go and talk about it later. There's also an interesting view on marriage, because there are over 3 types of marriages which are illustrated in the book, and they appear in one form or another, both as a certainty and as a plan, let's say. It's interesting to see first the union between Fitz and Bea, which illustrates the sort of marriage you would see around before the Great War happened, like in the 19th, 18th century, something like that. We talk about a union between 2 people, which is sort of like a business transaction. Princess Bea back in Russia was in really dire straits when she met Fitz, and she saw Fitz as her only way to save the family's estate and their reputation. Fitz comes into her life as a sort of savior, and he manages to pay off the debt of Bea's family and marries her. But it's not a marriage made out of love. Every time dialogue comes on between them, it's like a business transaction. Fitz wanted Bea because she was beautiful, she was attractive, she made him look good in society and made him a man envied by others, and she was the prospect of beautiful aristocratic children. In a way, they balance themselves out like that. This is, let's say, the traditional type of marriage. The second type of marriage is the marriage between Ethel and Mr. Lewick, I think he was called, Bernie. After her love affair with Fitz, she gets to marry a guy from East End, where she lives in London. But their marriage is not a marriage out of love. It's a marriage that is born out of affection, more like out of friendship, not so much out of strong physical attraction. Sometimes I felt that Ethel sort of settled into Bernie because he was close, he was smart, they had a lot of things in common, although the passion wasn't there. The third type of marriage which appears is also the tactical marriage, which is illustrated by Otto von Ulrich, who plans to marry his son off to a rich heiress, Monica von Helbert, which was the daughter of one of his acquaintances. She was of noble blood, and in the eyes of Otto, who is purely traditionalist, she was the perfect match for his son, as their union would have taken their blue blood further and make their nobiliary bond even stronger in the German society. However, what's interesting is the fact that for Walter, that's no longer an option. This already shows the shift as he decides to be that kind of guy that wants to marry whom he wants to marry. He no longer wants to have his life dictated by his parents or by tradition or by other conventions, which is already a big shift compared to the times before the war. Another relevant category is the one of cute love stories, such as the love story between Billy Williams and Mildred, and the story between Gus Dewar and his mysterious future wife, which will be a big surprise close to the end. I really digged both their stories, but especially the story of Gus Dewar, as his story was overall sad, and he suffered a lot throughout the book, only to find happiness in the end, which was really a nice touch. Second comes the war part, and oh boy, the war part is truly a handful. However, although it is a really big chunky part, it's surprisingly easy to understand. That's partly due to the fact that we have the war stories told from different points of view. Some of the characters in the book are diplomats, such as Walter von Ulrich with his father Otto, Robert von Ulrich. Fitz has some implications with English diplomacy in his position, in his military position. There's also Gus Dewar, which is a diplomat. And then we have the soldiers, which are on the battlefield and give us sort of a ground view on what the battle is like, what the living conditions are, what the orders given are, and what the overall situation is, sort of in a micro level. War is an absolutely absurd machine, and it's a machine that wastes the life of millions of people out of the great powers' blindness. The absurdity is beautifully illustrated throughout the book. We see we see diplomats judging war out of pure as an intellectual game, which means most of the time people who have no experience with war and people who have never set foot on a battlefield get to make the decisions which supposedly should change the fate of the battle. That's a really bad idea, as most of the time the troops which are on the field end up being lab rats for untested tactical strategies, which costs them the lives of millions, basically. It's also absurd to see just how arrogant those in charge are, and how they refuse to see the truth, even when the truth is plainly obvious to everyone, and most of the soldiers on the field are in mutiny, essentially. This is illustrated in the conflict between Fitz and Billy. Billy, being the son of a really good speaker, cannot keep quiet in face of injustice, and Fitz uses his position as colonel to punish him and send him to prison, basically prison which would encompass forced labor for 10 years. He would rather lock up a kid for 10 years than accept the fact that the British strategy is wrong. That's not the only case in which abuse of power is made. At one point, a captain sends his whole troop on the battlefield to actually get killed by the machine guns. He just sends them on the field and gives them some unclear instructions, at which point the machine guns start shooting and people fall as if they were leaves from a tree. That's really painful to read and really painful to think about. There are also sides to the war which we see on a small scale in the states which are implicated in the big war. We see queues for basic foods in Germany. We see them in Britain. We also see them in Russia. I think Russia is the country which was mostly touched by the war. Out of this greed to get a victory in the Great War, the great powers were willing to spend thousands of money on guns and not use those money to feed their people. In Russia, there's also a scene on the streets of St. Petersburg in which Grigory sees at some point a little girl which chose prostitution as a way to earn her living. We speak of kids here, actual kids which would practice prostitution just to get by, which is insane if we think about it in 2019. Also, the signs of poverty are clearly illustrated in Germany as well, and we see that the former glory of the von Ulrich family is slowly decaying. What was once a very luxurious house is repurposed. The luxurious garden becomes the place where they store goods, they grow pigs and vegetables in order to get by, just because they can use that space you know what I mean. They just use that space because they have it available to them, because they are noblemen and they can afford it, and they use it as a means to live a bit better than the next guy. My favorite point of view was the point of view of Billy. He gets into the war in trying to achieve something better, trying to gain more experience, and gets out of the war as a more mature man, as a better speaker, and as a defender of the little guy that goes on the battlefield, that fights his fear of death, and that fights sometimes in a war that doesn't really make sense, just to see what tomorrow might bring, hoping that tomorrow will be a better day. I also like the Grigori part of the book. He, as I said in the first part, has a rather sad storyline at first, but gradually finds a bit of happiness in all that unhappiness. What I absolutely hated was the Fitz part, obviously, because I wanted him to die already. But I think he was an important character because it illustrated the absurdity of the nobility, of those people who thought they knew everything, but in fact they knew nothing and were not eager to change or make a difference in a way that was still unknown to them. Third, we have the social movements, which are also an important aspect we should really consider when analyzing this book. At first, we only have some sort of clues about the women's movement and the suffragette movement, which would have enabled the women to vote for the first time in history. I think a very important focus in this book is the focus on women and on how they evolved from being a housewife like Queen Bea to being a woman that chooses her own destiny, such as Maud or Ethel even. Ethel is very significant from this point of view because she, although she is in dire straits at first, she manages to rise from her ashes and manages to achieve something from herself. She not only gets to work in a factory and support her family, she also gets involved in the Labour Party. She becomes an increasingly better speaker, at some point even becoming a strong candidate for the parliamentary elections, although her husband was at first the preferred one. It's really interesting to see the power struggle there because the early 20th century guy was not willing to accept that his woman might be even better than him. They were still not prepared for that shift, let's say. And it's interesting to see how Bernie was even willing to sacrifice his relationship only to be right, which is kind of sad for Ethel. However, I really think she doesn't get away with it. It's more like she really evolves beautifully because by the end of the book she actually manages to become a member in parliament, which was something unheard of for a woman. And I think it's interesting to see how one simple country girl can, after the war, make her own fate and make her own path. Yeah, I suppose we can say that Maud does it too, but however, Maud is from an aristocratic family. She was always exposed to great politicians. She was always involved in debates. She actually had the privilege, whereas Ethel worked every step of the way to achieve everything she got in the end, which is really interesting to see. I think from this societal point of view, it's interesting to see that the war was actually the victory of the little guy. This is illustrated by the Bolshevik movement in Russia, in which the little guy decided to take over the country and fight all the injustice they went through for centuries, essentially. It's really interesting to see how a guy such as Grigory, which starts the story as which in the beginning was a simple guy, let's say. He now manages to become someone important in the Bolshevik regime. Sure, the Bolsheviks were not great. However, it's a great example of how society can change if a small amount of people decides it's time for a change, and how that shifts the whole society as a whole. In Germany, we also see the changes that take place in the von Ulrich family, because Otto is no longer the emperor's protege, let's say. He somehow loses his place in society, whereas Walter and Maud fight to have their place in the new world, let's say. So yeah, shifts take place everywhere, and it's a beautiful, beautiful thing to watch. I think the most important takeaway we can get from this book is the fact that it makes us reflect on all the absurdity that took place out of the will of a small amount of people who knew nothing about anything. I think that's the most important takeaway. It teaches us that conflict will take place again during the Second World War. And from what I heard, the second volume will be all about that. However, I will stop at this novel for now. And my next read is going to be something you already heard me talk about, which is A Gentleman in Moscow. I really enjoyed reading the first 100 pages of this. And a little teaser alert, it's really a book made to my heart, which should say a lot. But more on that on some future video. I'm glad that you stuck up with me. I hope you enjoyed this video. Hit the heart button. And I hope to see you again soon.